Hi, welcome to this taster lecture about pirates for Gonville and Keyes College. I'm Antonio. I'm a PhD student in history here at the University of Cambridge. And today this taster lecture will hopefully give you a sense of what it is like to attend a university lecture. So the style, the language, and the kind of content that you might expect to find when you go to university, if you go to university. Particularly in a history degree, although pirates can be also studied in departments like politics or sociology even. I'll be looking at it from a history perspective, looking at piracy through the ages. So today we're going to be looking at pirates from different places and pirates operating in different times in history. And you know, pirates are heavily mediatized individuals nowadays. You can think of, you know, Pirates of the Caribbean and Jack Sparrow and Captain Hook and all these very popular figures. But you know, pirates are also a deeply historical phenomenon. And in this lecture today, I want to go beyond, beyond the movies, beyond Captain Jack Sparrow, and think about pirates historically. Think about them a bit in a more academic sense. So today we're going to be looking at Somali pirates from the 21st century. So very contemporary form of piracy. And we're going to be going all the way back to the Caribbean, to the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And we're going to be looking at two kinds of pirates operating there. We're going to be looking at the Buccaneers, operating mostly in the late 17th century in the Caribbean, and the pirates of the Golden Age of piracy, happening mostly in the early 18th century in the Caribbean. And we're going to see how these three groups of pirates, so these two pirates in the 17th and 18th century Caribbean, and the more contemporary Somali pirates of the 21st century, how despite them all being pirates, they're pirates in very different ways, or rather, they are seen by the people of the time in different ways. So despite piracy remaining, you know, a similar kind of phenomenon, it is constructed in a different way, and therefore gains a different meaning. So this is kind of the themes and the ideas that we're going to be grappling with today. And as I said, going a bit beyond the Hollywood version of pirates. So, how are we gonna think about this? We're going to think about this in terms of a relationship between pirates and states. If you're not familiar with the word state, think about it as a synonym for country, right? If you end up going to university studying subjects like history or politics or even economics, etc., you will get a bit more of an understanding of what the state is and what this word means. But think about states as countries. Think about it as a synonym. So I'll use the words interchangeably. So we're going to be thinking about the relationship between pirates and states, specifically how states see pirates at a particular time in a particular place. So how pirates are constructed by the state, and especially we're going to be thinking about them in terms of the kind of threat that they present, right? So how is the pirate threat constructed by states? And what we're going to be seeing is that actually, despite being, a very comparable, the phenomenon itself, the act of piracy might be very similar across these different places and different times, the type of threat that the pirate presents is constructed in a very different way. So the status of pirates, the legal, political, ontological status, to put a big word there which you might have to look up, the status of pirates ends up being quite different And what we see is that it varies depending on a historical context. So actually the status of pirates ends up being historically dependent. And this is kind of the overall idea that we're grappling with. So let's get straight into it. And the first thing that I'm gonna touch on briefly is something that you'll always come across, or almost always, very frequently will come across at university in studying different kinds of things, and which, you know, doesn't just apply to pirates, doesn't just apply to the study of history. You know, it's kind of like a pervasive thing that academics have to deal with, which is defining your terms. So when we're talking about pirates, one of the first things that we need to do when we're writing an essay about it, doing a presentation like the one I'm doing today, one of the first things we always have to do is define what are we talking about? What do we mean by pirate? What do we mean by piracy, right? So, you know, and academics often disagree on how to define concepts like this one. So, you know, piracy, like many other terms, can be seen as a contested concept, and it's important to make clear what we mean by it. So the definition that I'm basing this presentation on is the definition by Mark Shirk, who is actually a lecturer here at the University of Cambridge. He taught me in a course about pirates in my master's year. And you know, my PhD, for example, is actually in a topic quite different from this one. I researched modern European history, but I studied pirates in my master's with Mark Shirk. And his definition is that, and I'll quote, piracy is the act of boarding any vessel with intent to commit theft or to drive change regarding the possession of goods on board, and with an intent or capacity to use force in furtherance of that act. So what we're talking really is about, you know, pirates being on a ship, boarding another ship in order to steal things from that other ship, and having the capacity and will to use force in order to achieve that goal, right? So this is kind of what this definition tells us about piracy. And you know, and some things to think about is, you know, would this definition apply to things like digital piracy, big topic nowadays, or space piracy, you know, conceptual problems like this one. And you know, you might notice that in the definition I gave you, the word crime or criminal is not there, right? We're talking about the act of boarding any vessel with the intent to commit theft or to drive change regarding the possession of goods, and with the capacity to use force. But in no part of it does it qualify this kind of action as a crime, or you know, it doesn't call pirates criminals. Should it? Should it do so, or should it not? You know, things to think about, and these are the kinds of things that academics studying subjects like piracy will try to unpack and will argue one way or another. So things to think about. But you know, now that we've defined our terms, we can get stuck into the history of the pirates. And you know, pirates and states, they have a very, it's an ever-changing relationship across history, you know? So specifically when we think about the threatening aspect of pirates, you know, in the Caribbean, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, pirates of the Golden Age, for example, they were called, you know, enemies of humanity. They were, you know, the phrase in Latin is hostes humani generis, meaning, you know, enemies of humanity. People, you know, states across Europe during that time saw pirates as an enemy of all kinds of civilized people. You know, they were an enemy of humanity. And this is interesting because, you know, in the 21st century, when we're thinking about pirates operating in Somalia, the Somali pirates, a very similar narrative applies. You know, the challenging the pirate threat in Somalia it was the first time since World War II that the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and these are, if you're not familiar with the United Nations and the Security Council, to give you a sense of what that means is, it's basically when the United Nations was formed, it was kind of decided that these were the 5 great powers of the world, and therefore they should have, kind of a bigger say in what goes on in the Security Council. The history is a lot more complex than this, but just for you to have a sense of what it might be, this is what we're talking about. And these 5 powers are the United States, Russia, China, France, and the UK, right? So, as I was saying, in dealing with the Somali pirates, it was the first time since World War II that these 5 countries, think very different countries, right? Like China, Russia, the United States. We know that these are countries with some at different points difficult relations. They all agreed on the nature of the piracy threat in Somalia. They agreed on the severity of the threat, and they agreed to deploy forces on the same side of that conflict. First time since World War II that all these countries decide to do so. So, what this basically means, what we're grappling with here in terms of these Golden Age pirates and the Somali pirates, is a narrative of universality, of states agreeing on the nature of this threat. They agree that this is a kind of threat that is pervasive. Pirates are a threat to all states. It's a very interesting narrative. Pirates are not just seen as being in opposition to the state. They're not just seen as as enemies in a legible way. They're really seen as something which falls outside of the boundaries of what is considered normal or acceptable, right? So the narrative goes beyond the state. There is almost an element of degeneracy. It's very interesting. So yeah. So basically, what I'm saying is, to simplify it, pirates are seen as a universal threat to states in these 2 cases. In Somalia in the 21st century, in the Caribbean, the Golden Age pirates of the early 18th century. However, this is where things start getting interesting. Not all pirates. Remember that we're dealing with 3 cases here in this lecture, and we've only mentioned 2 right now in regards to this universality narrative. Not all pirates are constructed by states as being a universal threat. So, for example, the Buccaneers of the late 17th century in the Caribbean, they're a very interesting kind of pirate. Why? Because the Buccaneers were pirates who were provided with this letter from the state, from governments, which told them that they were allowed to go about their piracy in particular ways in particular places. So they basically sailed under the sponsorship of a particular monarch. You see, already very different from what's happening with the pirates of the Golden Age and with the Somali pirates, right? These Buccaneers, so long as they operated in a way that the state condoned, and that kind of meant, that meant operating beyond the line, beyond this line where, in the Atlantic, where European powers thought that, beyond that line it is acceptable for this kind of piracy to exist. These pirates were seen as falling within the boundaries of what is acceptable to the state. They were, if the Golden Age pirates or the Somali pirates are seen as evil criminals, the Buccaneers were often seen as heroes. They were often seen, very interesting, they were often seen as patriotic heroes, people who advanced the interest of the government. So what it did was they basically what the Buccaneers presented was a form of violence which was sanctioned by the state. It was it was considered common practice. It was acceptable, right? So the pirates were not constructed as a threat to the state. They were only seen as a threat to other states. Like other states would see them as threats. Because, say, for example, there would be buccaneers that would be provided with this letter by the British government. And they would go about in their plundering activities, targeting, say, Dutch ships and Spanish ships. So, for the Dutch and for the Spanish, these buccaneers might be a threat. But for the British, they were not. They were, rather than being a threat, they were actually a very useful tool in terms of this competition in the oceans, right? So here we have it. We have a form of sanctioned violence, which contrasts very heavily with that universal enemy narrative, which was attached to the Golden Age pirates and the Somali pirates. You see, so already we see that pirates in the same place in the Caribbean, in very close periods, or pirates in different places, different times, they can be the same act, the same phenomenon of piracy can be constructed in very different ways, and therefore the meaning attached to it, the status of the pirate, can be very different. Now, another thing that is worth thinking about, or worth unpacking a bit more, is the kind of threat that these pirates presented to the states, right? So, what I'm going to be talking a bit more about for the last bit of the lecture is about how the Golden Age pirates and the Somali pirates, they might both be seen as enemies of humanity, but the type of threat that they present is actually different, right? So despite being constructed as a threat or not as a threat, the type of threat presented is still different. There are still more layers to it. It's not just pirates are threatening or pirates are not threatening. The lines are blurrier and there are more layers, they're more complex. So the pirates who are a threat might be a threat in different ways. And the pirates that are not a threat, that also might play out in different ways as well. And so I'll say a bit more about each one of these three groups of pirates, right? I'll say a bit more about the Somali pirates of the 21st century, the Golden Age pirates of the early 18th century in the Caribbean, and the Buccaneers of the late 17th century in the Caribbean as well. And we'll start closest to where we are today. We'll start in the 21st century in Somalia. And what we see into the 21st century in Somalia is a narrative which casts these pirates as a form of criminal violence, right? So the narrative casts them as a threat by the way that the narrative casts them as a threat involves focusing on the negative impact of the pirates on important things for the states like trade, shipping, development. There's an impact on security costs. So the impact is economic, and therefore the pirates are presenting a criminal form of threat. They are challenging the economic interests of the state, right? They're stealing and causing economic damage. So it's a criminal form of violence. So these pirates offer a type of violence which is outside of the state. It is not considered acceptable, so it is beyond the boundaries of the state. But it is also worth saying that they are not a challenge to the state itself, or sort of like ontologically. They steal from the state, and so they're unwanted and undesired criminals. But the threat that they presented is economic. It's not a political threat, right? They are a form of violence which operates outside of, but not necessarily challenges this sovereign state, right? So basically, they are seen as operating beyond notions of state power. This is kind of what we're dealing with 21st century Somali pirates in terms of the threat posed to states. Now, it's quite different in what concerns the 18th century Golden Age pirates. Quite different. These pirates were seen as presenting a threat to the very nature of the state itself, right? So they were not just an economic threat, they were a political threat as well. This is a significant difference. The claims of the pirates were illegible to the state. They were seen as being a challenge to the existing political order, right? So the way we might label this kind of violence, if the Somali pirates were a form of criminal violence in terms of the way that they were constructed by the state in these narratives, the Golden Age pirates are seen as a kind of a revisionist violence. Revisionist because they attempt to revise the existing political order, right? They attempt to look at it and change it, right? So this form of piracy goes beyond mere crime. This is a political threat. They present an ontological threat to the state as a political form. And therefore, what we're really seeing here is a challenge to state power, right? So if the Somali pirates operated beyond notions of state power, the Golden Age pirates are a direct challenge to political power, right? And now on to our final group of pirates, and these are the 17th century Buccaneers. Remember, these are the ones that were given a letter by states to go about their piracy activities, and therefore were only a challenge to other states, really. And what this means is that in terms of the threat posed to states, and I've alluded to this before a bit earlier, by being employed by states, the Buccaneers were seen as a threat in the context of international competition, interstate competition, but not as a threat in themselves. Right? They were basically a resource. They were a resource that states could afford or could not afford, right? So, the British might be able to afford having some pirates working for them in the Caribbean, promoting British interest in the Caribbean by stealing from other nations, for example. And other nations perhaps couldn't afford as many Buccaneers, couldn't afford to hire as many, or none at all. So basically the Buccaneers are a type of, resource violence. The label is resource. If the 21st century Somali pirates were a type of criminal violence, and the Golden Age pirates were a type of revisionist violence, the Buccaneers are constructed as a type of resource violence. They present a type of violence which is very much it can very much be seen in the context of resources rather than politics or economics. Not politics, but rather than a revisionist political threat or a more criminal threat is what I meant. So these pirates present a type of violence operating within the confines of state-sponsored activity, right? And they are seen as being directed by state power. So, we're coming to the end of the lecture now, and so it's worth going over a few of the points I've made. But really, one of the big aims of this lecture was to go beyond those Hollywood typical versions of pirates as these very entertaining characters, which are not that complex in terms of the political or economic reality of the historical context in which they are embedded. But actually, pirates are a phenomenon with significant political dimensions and economic dimensions. And they're it's a multi-layered phenomenon, which is worth investigating with some depth. And academics in different universities and other places, in other institutes across the world, investigate these pirates of the past in various ways. So just to go over some of the key ideas from the lecture. Basically, if you remember one thing, I think it might be worth, and this is really something that is relevant not just to study pirates but to study most historical subjects, is that piracy as a phenomenon is not this absolute obvious stagnant phenomenon. The phenomenon might be similar, the activity might be similar across different places and different times in history, but it is the meaning attached to it, the way it is constructed, is can be quite different. And so we see these different pirates, the Buccaneers, the Golden Age pirates, the Somali pirates. They're doing similar things. They're boarding ships in order to steal, and sometimes using some violence to do so. But the states, the organized political order of the time, perceives them in quite different ways. They might be the worst of criminals. They might be the most useful, strategic heroes, right? They might be patriotic heroes with a very strategic relevancy, right? So, this tells us that the status of pirates historically is context dependent. It depends a lot on the narratives that are in place in a particular time, in a particular place. And so is the case with other phenomena as well, which, if you come and study history here at Cambridge or at some other university, you will be dealing with interesting subjects like piracy and other ones, which are studied in these ways, and you'll understand the complexities of discourses which enveloping these phenomena. So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining. I hope you enjoyed this TESOL lecture for Gonville and Caius College. I'm Antonio. Thank you for being with me, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I wish you all the best for your future studies.